Social justice in video games. Let's dive right in. Okay, so some of my favorite games are believable due to the social injustice in the games, such as Fallout New Vegas, Kenshi, Stellaris, and CK2. They're all incredibly believable worlds, relatable, um, but their communities also can be notorious for being toxic or hate filled. Not the whole community, but there's definitely subsections. And this is the conundrum of social injustice in video games. So let's first go over the pros. So a richer lore helps you roleplay better, puts you in some interesting ethical problems, and it really helps you think about things because it's different, but also at the same time representative of things in the real world. So for example, the Oasis quest in Fallout 3, one of my favorite quests of all time, has you, um, spoiler warning, essentially have to pick between, do you share these new uh, trees that do well in the apocalypse with everyone? Do you hoard it for a select few? Um, or somewhere in between? And so you got this question, basically, about what you need to do ethically. And it doesn't seem like a social justice kind of question immediately, but this is something that we're constantly talking about in society, is how do we share things, who can be trusted with things, and ethical questions like this are not possible if we're trying to avoid justice and social inequality. To give you more relatable examples, if we're talking about in New Vegas, the NCR is by far and large a bureaucrat nightmare where it's just corruption embodied and like cover-ups, and it's just insane. The United Cities in Kenshi is very similar. They totally are run by nobles. They have slavery of people who are poor. It's a crime to be poor in their society. And these factions, they deal with like fictional factions within them. Like the United Cities has got all these different like fantasy races living in there. And like the Holy Nation is totally like xenophobic and hates anything that's not human. And these give us like some safe places to discuss issues around things like xenophobia and corruption and cover-ups and all those issues, just by making it different enough from the real world, it helps us talk about these things. And you see some really cool points that people make on forums, and one of my favorite conversations that I've ever had was with my brother about the Legion, because Legions are obviously the bad guys, but he had done a Legion playthrough and was parroting what a lot of people say about how the NCR is corrupt and politicians are just evil and democracy doesn't work. And it was parroting a lot of what people say in the real world about dictators actually not being all that bad. It helps people like me who, white, upper middle class citizen in the United States, helps me understand some of the brainwashing and perspectives of people who actually live under dictators or in countries where they hear things and they see things and they think of it as so much better, That being said, it helps me understand that perspective. The concern is that it actually might affect how some people see the real world, or help validate how people already are seeing the real world. And this can create those echo chambers, and we also gotta be careful with sarcasm. There's so many posts on all those forums, Kenshi, Stellaris, CK2, the Fallout forums, where people are saying things sarcastically, and it's like, we gotta be real careful about that. and bring in more people, because then we're gonna have more interesting conversations around these things, and we'll have better games for it. Having different perspectives. It's like Afrofuturism. If you've ever read any Afrofuturistic book, it's different, and it's cool to experience a different story. And so I want more people coming into these spaces, and to do that, we can't have discrimination as much, and we gotta make people feel comfortable. We gotta also be comfortable with being uncomfortable to have these conversations. That's different than actively making someone feel bad. Like when you're going and making these jokes, you're not trying to bring that person in a lot of the time. You may think that you are, but the end result is these negative psychological effects. But I did want to, because I know some people are going to disagree with me on this, actually show some scientific papers talking about these things. And if you can find some scientific papers that have a bigger impact factor than these that contradict that, please let me know. I would love to see that. And so, like, another example of this in video games would be the Stellaris and the purging pops mechanisms that you have in the game. Like, you can actually go around, and it sounds weird to someone who doesn't play the game or is outside of the community. You can go around and essentially line up aliens to be purged or just killed or even turned into food. It's a good game mechanic, and it creates in of itself, it creates an interesting gameplay scenario where you might be fighting a faction that's actively trying to exterminate you, and it is something that I don't want to see removed from the game, but it also makes me extremely uncomfortable when I'm hearing jokes about these, because I do think it emboldens hate, and it makes people who are actually hateful feel like, for example, the Reddit for them or the Discord for them or whatever is filled with other people who actually think like they do. When most of the people are just totally being sarcastic and just joking around, it creates a safe space, which I personally have an issue with. So then it comes to, what do we actually do about this? Games have been censored for a very long time, voluntarily and involuntarily. In of itself, it's not necessarily a bad thing, especially to have some outsiders weighing in on these topics. For example, I wouldn't be too happy if someone told me you can't talk about suppression of democracies in other countries because you don't live there. It's always the what's the Picard quote from Star Trek? Something about interfering with internal matters is the so like when people are doing unethical things, they don't want people from outside criticizing them, and they're saying, hey, this isn't anything you should be going into. I do think that the gaming community does that. And censorship, yeah, we do want to be really careful with it, and it can be done right, and it can definitely be done wrong. It really depends. So for example, violence in Australia, how they don't let any violence really in video games. I do have an issue with that. I don't like that censorship. But then there's the flip side of that, like the Nazi symbols in Germany. I get that. That totally makes sense. Then you have games like Wolfenstein, where I think they just recently allowed some Nazi symbology in there, but traditionally they haven't. And it's kind of weird because these guys are clearly the bad guys. It's like a cartoonish good-bad fight, which in of itself I don't really like. It simplifies the world in a lot of ways which are dangerous. But it's very clear these guys are the bad guys, and it's a very clear message that, these are Nazis, and it's kind of weird that we know they're Nazis and they're dressed like Nazis, but then you can't have that one symbol. It just takes away from the realism and the atmosphere of the game. Which, I get where some people are like, well, that's worth it to not spread hate, but it's not like glorifying the Nazis. If anything, we're demonizing them in that game, which is a good thing. There's other things in games where it's like, CK2, you can have childhood assassination plots, which is great. That's in the game. And it reminds me of how in the old Fallout games, you could kill children. But in the newer ones, you can't. They're made immortal, which is... it totally is game breaking. It breaks that sense of this is a real world, and it makes it so you can't talk about real trauma and real experiences. And if you allow these game mechanics, you do some pretty horrible things. And if done correctly, it makes you feel pretty horrible about yourself. And it helps you build empathy. It helps you understand why people do certain things in the real world. Instead of looking down on them and saying, man, I wouldn't do that if I was in that situation, you might kind of be like, oh, I kind of get why you did this thing that is wrong. And, that is a good starting off point for actually talking about how to make things right, is recognizing why people are doing things wrong. So here's where games become a little bit different than other mediums. Games in particular let you be someone else, living life through someone else's eyes. It helps you experience what it's like to be privileged or not privileged. It helps you experience all kinds of interesting things like discrimination and corruption and cover-ups, all that kind of stuff. I mean, just in Kenshi, you can be enslaved. And if you do get enslaved, you're gonna hate that faction. Like it really, I mean, in the game it's actually not that bad to be enslaved. It's actually good for your stats in a number of ways, unless you don't lose a limb. But like, if you get enslaved by the Holy Nation, you're gonna be like, I hate those dudes. And you're gonna probably want to go to war and actively kill them. And that helps you kind of understand, as for me, as a white person living in the United States, even though I myself am not a slave owner or a descendant of a slave owner, it makes me understand why people might have some resentment towards the United States in general, or white people in the United States, because it really is horrible to go through that, right? And it's just, in the game it's frustrating, but it helps you kind of like see like, oh, I get why you guys might not want to, for example, stand during the Pledge of Allegiance. You might hate this institution because of what it's done. But then here's the other thing, it can also put you in the place to reinforce social justice, and here's the problem, is that really concerns me, is when we're allowing people to create social injustice and there's no reflection going on there, or it's not really real. So for example, video games glorify violence a lot, but a lot of the times they don't really show the PTSD that comes with that. They don't show the mental health problems that come with that. One of my favorite examples where they do this is in Far Cry 3. The character's arc is that they just slowly go insane. As they kill more people, they're becoming more and more disconnected from the people that care about them, and pushing people away, and just like they get into this game-like mentality, and you can see how horrible it is and how horribly he ends up treating about other people and not even caring about his own life. It's an interesting story, and it really is done well. But most games, it's just like, yeah, shoot things, it's super cool, or yeah, go kill things, it's super cool, and they don't really show that like mental anguish that actually puts on people, which I would like to see more in video games. So in conclusion, by censoring social injustice, we're avoiding conversations that we need to have. But if we don't have those conversations, this injustice in the game could just be reinforcing it in the real world. So I feel like the problem isn't the social injustice in the game, it's the structures that we have to deal with it or talk about it, or that the games in of themselves aren't dealing or talking about how to fix some of those issues, or empowering people to have those conversations. So let me know what you guys think. Do you guys agree? Do you disagree? Do you have any other good examples that might be related to this that I omitted? I mean, I could have gone on for... There's so many things I want to talk about in this as examples. But I had to just kind of trim it down to keep a narrative. So yeah, let me know what you think. Thanks for listening to my TED Talk.